All right. Well, welcome to Käthe Wright Kaufman. Many of you have met here at Glenn as our Associate Director of Worship and Music and our organist. And so we are just delighted to have her with us for the Friendship Group today. Some of you have seen her short video she's been providing for us on our YouTube channel, but we get our own special insights into Käthe, who she is, and about a tour of the organ today as well. So Käthe, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's such a delight to be here, and thank you so much for asking me to come and present. And it's also a delight, I should say, to be a part of the Glen community now. I still feel pretty new. I only got here in May, but I'm still also starting to settle into the routine and getting to recognize faces and learn names. So thank you for being so welcoming during this time, this new period for me. So I thought I'd start by just giving you a bit of my personal background and my musical journey. And so I'm from Evanston, Illinois, which is the suburb right next to Chicago, Illinois, where Northwestern University is. And I grew up there at an Episcopal church, St. Luke's Episcopal Church. And that is where I first encountered the amazing sound of the organ and first joined the choir. And that was sort of my way into music. Like many children do, I took piano lessons probably from age 4 to 8 or something. But then, like many children do, I quit for baseball, which is regrettable, but it still gave me enough of a foundation in keyboard technique that it was able to serve me later on when I took up the organ. So I did piano for a few years, and I also joined the choir at my church when I was about 8 years old. And I was very lucky to be at a church where the choir program was pretty rigorous. It taught me to read music. It taught me the order of worship service and the liturgical year and sort of the ins and outs of worship, especially in the Episcopal tradition. But, you know, there's lots of overlap in the Methodist tradition as well. So I think it's really served me well in this post as well. And that choir was modeled after the Anglican tradition. So the way that boys and girls now in England, usually they are choristers at a cathedral, and they will go before school and after school to rehearse and to sing for evensong and for other worship services, sometimes up to 6 or 7 times a week. So I wasn't singing quite that often, but I was learning a bit of that same repertoire and getting to know those same skill sets. So I was in the choir pretty much from ages 8 to 18, I would say, which was, it provided a constant community for me and also a place to learn about music, especially in service to the church. And then in 8th grade, I started to learn the pipe organ. I say 8th grade because, you know, you have to be tall enough to reach the pedals. And for me, I also had to meet the right person who would become my teacher. But I did in 8th grade. It was the choir director at the church where I was singing. And so it was sort of the natural next step in my quest as a church musician. And my piano training, as I mentioned, really helped me and gave me a good starting base. But the organ is actually pretty different from the piano. And I don't think many people realize that. So when you play the piano, the touch and how you use your arm weights is very different from when you play the organ. Because the piano, when you press harder on the key, you get a louder sound. Whereas on the organ, the way it's built, it's a very fascinating and complex machine, organs are. But that being said, when you press down the key, it doesn't matter how hard you press. You're going to get the same volume every time. So that means that you have to find other ways to be expressive, whether that's with your timing or the combination of sounds that you use and so forth. So even though the organ looks like a piano as far as the keyboards being the same, it's actually a very different instrument. So it did feel a bit like starting from scratch. By the beginning of my high school career, I was pretty determined that I wanted to be a musician and to pursue that as a profession and as a vocation. And as the college application period drew closer, I had to convince my parents to let me pursue that as my main thing rather than having a liberal arts degree as a backup. Because, you know, what parent wants their child to grow up and be a starving musician? But for me, it's always been about being fulfilled and spiritually fed by my music. So if that means I have to eat rice and beans every day, so be it. But luckily, there are such positions that allow you to eat some protein every now and then too. And thankfully, I think it was a very good choice to pursue music as my main focus. And my thinking was that if I have the chance to do something and put my all into it, I might as well do that instead of splitting myself between several things at once. So I ended up at the Eastman School of Music, which is in upstate New York, in Rochester, New York. I feel like Eastman doesn't have quite the same name recognition as Juilliard does, but we're probably on the same level, if not a bit better, I would have to say. Other really good organ schools these days are Indiana University, Rice University in Texas, Yale has a great organ program, Curtis in Philadelphia, Westminster Choir College in Princeton used to. So there are many good places to study the organ even today. And I think as a profession, it's probably still growing in popularity. I feel like when we talk about the church as a whole, but also organ in the church, we tend to look at it negatively, saying, oh, it's dying out. People aren't going to church anymore. People don't want to hear an organ anymore. They want a rock and roll band playing praise music. So being an optimist and having invested myself in this vocation, I say that's not true. There's plenty of interest. Just look at all of the undergraduates studying organ today, and it is thriving in that sense, which is a good thing, but also means the field is a bit too saturated. But that's all right. So going to Eastman was really wonderful for me. Like many people, I think I felt more comfortable in a college setting than I did in the very stressful setting of high school and middle school as well. And at Eastman, I was able to finally be surrounded by people that also loved music as much as I did. It wasn't just going to band period in the middle of your day to do music as an extra thing on the side, but music was the main thing. And that felt so good for me, for it to not be an extracurricular, but the main curriculum for me. And at Eastman, I studied music in various forms. So that included music theory, music history, or musicology, we say. And then more specifically, sacred music, reading about the theology behind the music and its role in the service, as well as how different denominations use music, and historically, as well as in the present day, and just getting to really think hard about things that I'd never thought of, or things that I hadn't been exposed to, only having really worked in the Episcopal tradition before. And during my time at Eastman, I also had several church jobs. One was Episcopal, but another was Presbyterian. So that was my first sort of foray out of the Anglican world. And it was great to observe how many overlaps there were in the structure of the service and in the pieces we use and the hymns we use and in the things that work that way. So I found that very refreshing and encouraging. So I had 4 years at Eastman. And then afterwards, I decided to take a gap year before continuing on to my master's studies. And having grown up in the Anglican choral tradition, I decided to try to go work for a year in England. And thankfully, I feel very grateful for all the connections I made through Eastman, because, just like in many other careers and sort of job worlds, it is sometimes about who you know. So I had some very useful letters of recommendation, but I also did audition, and I tended to play pretty well on the days I had to, and I got this position at a cathedral in England to be their organ scholar. So this was in Cornwall in the southwest of the UK at Truro Cathedral. And if any of you have been to that part of England, it is such a gorgeous part. There's a beautiful coastal path. The Wesleys went to preach there, so there are ties to Methodism, lots of Methodist churches down there. And it was just a dream come true for me, because I got to be fully plunged into this tradition that I grew up sort of in a generalized version of as an Episcopal chorister. Getting to go right to the roots, into the source of the Anglican choral tradition was very exciting for me. And so as the organ scholar, my role, there were many things I did, lots of other duties as assigned, but mostly what I did was teaching the youngest choristers. So these are 8-year-old boys that have 45 minutes to choir before their school day, and then come back to the cathedral to sing services most nights. I think the boys sang about 4 times a week, and the girls probably sang 2 or 3 times a week. So I would teach those 8-year-old boys music theory, how to sing, how to read music, all that stuff. And I would also accompany the choir. So I used my organ skills to play voluntaries and other pieces before and after the services. And I also got to accompany the psalms and the anthems that happen in those evensong services. I also kept the music library organized and made sure that everyone in the choir had the right music for the right day. So lots of administrative work, which I happen to like. So that means, you know, on a Sunday morning, you would sing for Mass or Eucharist in the morning, and then I would switch out the music between 30 sets of folders, probably 5 pieces of music for each one, ready in time for the evening service on Sunday for evensong. So I spent a lot of time in the music library, getting to know the music there, and fully aware and appreciative of the tradition that I was part of. Because, you know, at Truro, they've been singing services since the late 19th century, but in England, those services have been going on for far longer. So I was very proud to be a part of it, especially as an American, which seems a bit naughty, but I think I found out that I was the 21st American to ever be organ scholar in an English cathedral. So that is something I wear very proudly, that badge. So that year in Truro was very transformative for me. It showed me sort of the heights of the specific type of music that I had been participating in before. And it showed me what a really well-trained choir that sings so frequently and rehearses so frequently, what they can sound like and what they can achieve and how they can enhance a worship service. And even though when I was quote unquote on duty during those services, having to pay attention, turning pages for the organist or playing myself, I was still able to worship in my own way and appreciate just how everything sort of came together in the service and in the progression of the service. So that was a really special year for me. And then I decided to go back to Eastman for my master's degree. Looking back, I kind of wish I'd stayed in England another year, because it sort of felt like I just understood how everything worked right when the year finished. And I would have loved another year to sort of be a bit more comfortable and confident in my playing. But that wasn't to be, because I had already committed to my master's degree the previous year, and I just deferred by a year. So I went back to Eastman, but I was very energized and refreshed in doing so. And I studied with a different teacher, my professor, David Higgs, and he is known for having really wonderful technique, especially, as well as being a great interpreter of the repertoire. So I went in those 2 years being very determined to get as much as I could out of him. It didn't hurt that I was paying for that degree myself and was aware of how much it was worth. So I practiced as hard as I could. I maybe didn't go to as many social events as I did in my undergraduate years, which is part of becoming an adult and hunkering down and doing the work. And I think that paid off, because I learned a great deal of repertoire, and I learned it very thoroughly, which is great. And that's sort of, there's an eternal journey as a musician, I think, of learning how to teach yourself, because you can have lessons every now and then, but eventually you need to get to the space where you're confident enough to be your own teacher and to know, okay, I've put the work in, this piece sounds finished. It may still evolve as time goes on, but I've mastered and I understand the core of this piece. So my master's degree really helped me become at least closer to a master of music, which is the name of the degree I got. Well, I loved my time back in Rochester, but I missed England, and so I decided to go back to England. And in the fall of 2019, I went back to a different cathedral this time, to Peterborough Cathedral, which is in the county of Cambridgeshire. It's probably about 40 minutes from Cambridge on the train and close to Ely, and probably just around an hour from London on the train as well. So that's a much more central location than Truro, which is way down in the corner in the southwest. Which meant that I was able to go on day trips to other places like York, which has an amazing cathedral, and Ely and Bury St. Edmunds and Lincoln and lots of places like that. And so it was a very similar setup as my time as organ scholar in Truro, but I was dealing with slightly different age groups of children. In Truro, the boys were ages 8 to 13, but the girls were in high school, ages 13 to 18, whereas in Peterborough, both the boys and the girls were ages 8 to 13. So it was new for me to get to work with a slightly younger group of girls, but I really enjoyed that, since I also started as a chorister at age 8. And it was definitely a different experience. It's sort of a different feel, because Peterborough is very much an industrial working city, whereas Truro is more like a quaint boutique town by the coast. So I'm grateful that I got to experience both types. But of course, the commonality was the evensong services and the amazing organs I got to play. Now, we all know what happened in March 2020 when COVID descended. Luckily, the choir had just taken a tour to San Francisco in February. So it felt a bit funny going on tour to my home country, but actually I'd never been to California, so that was lovely. And to escape the winter of England in February was not bad either. And so we went to San Francisco, we sang at Grace Cathedral, we also sang around Los Angeles, and that was a lovely time. And we sort of were aware of COVID coming, but still not worried. But then we got back and things got a bit more serious. So we had to stop services, of course, and school went virtual. We all know what happened. Things that happened here were very parallel to what happened in England, even though our governments handled things slightly differently, I think, but more or less everything was shut down. So for me, living alone in my flat in Peterborough, no longer having access to that choral community, it was pretty hard. Thankfully, we have Zoom and Skype and FaceTime. So I, like many others, I think, got to reconnect with older friends and start being more communicative, which was very useful. But I wasn't allowed to practice the organ, which was a real shame, because that's always been a lifeline for me. If things are feeling hard outside of just day in, day out, if my work is stressing me out, or if I'm worried about something, or I'm meditating on the state of our world at the moment too much, I can escape and go practice the organ, and I can just focus on getting the notes right and appreciate what Bach has written or whoever, and just focus on the music. So it was hard not to have that available to me for those first couple months. Luckily, I did have a piano in my flat, so I was able to do some practice there. But then once things relaxed a tiny bit, and we learned about how to sanitize everything, looking back, the surfaces aren't actually the big deal we thought they were, but still lots of spraying down organ keyboards. I was able to practice again and learn a whole bunch of music, which was really lovely for me, sort of brain food for me to stay engaged and to stay motivated. And then eventually we also did Zoom teaching with the choristers. So that was a very different dynamic from the sort of rehearsal setting where they're all very energetic, crowded around the piano, and you have to get them to be quiet and listen. But if it's on Zoom, they're probably a bit more shy. You have to coax them out of their shell, and you can't, sing together because of the time delay. So there are some new challenges to figure out during that COVID period, but it was still very valuable to learn how to teach in that setting as well. So even though I may not have enjoyed it very much at the time, I'm grateful I had that experience at the end of my time in Peterborough. And after that, I came back to the States in the middle of last September, and I had a bit of soul searching to figure out what my next step would be. And thankfully, they brought me here to Atlanta, to Glenn. And I think we're all caught up now because you know that I'm here. So all that to say, it's been a very interesting journey for me, especially getting to experience different denominations and how much overlap there is and how similar they are, as well as valuing the differences between them. So now I want to talk about what I love about the organ as an instrument. If you're a concert pianist, if you're playing concerts all over the world, say, and you go to Carnegie Hall and you play, there's probably going to be a Steinway there, and you play the Steinway, and it feels a bit different from the Steinway that you played in Hong Kong last week, which feels a bit different from the Steinway you played in Berlin last week before that. But more or less, every piano is pretty much the same. You can't say that for these instruments, the organ. Organs are very different from one another. If you just think about how different this instrument is from the organ in the Little Chapel, for example, and how different that one is from the organ in the Schwartz Center, which is much bigger, it just means that you always have a challenge to figure out how to make something work, how to make a piece of music work well on the instrument and with what you have available from that instrument. So it's a constant puzzle of how to adapt, which I think is very interesting. And when you find something that works, it's very rewarding. So sometimes you might find yourself on an organ that was designed to play French music, but you have to play a piece of Bach, who was not French. And so you have to be creative and you have to make some certain decisions about which sounds you use and what combinations you use. And that's always been a really fun challenge for me. The other thing that I like about the organ as an instrument in general is that it is so versatile. Not only is every instrument different from each other, but within an instrument, you have so many different sound options. And it's basically like having an orchestra at your fingertips. So to demonstrate, now, just a disclaimer that the sound, if I play too loud, I have a feeling it might get a bit hard to hear exactly what I'm playing. So thank you for your patience. But so to begin with, we have our flutes like you would have in an orchestra. So here is a flute. You able to hear that more or less? Great. Okay, so we have our flutes. Another thing we find in the orchestra are the strings. So this is a stop called viol de gambe, which is like a viola da gamba, but really it's sort of like a viola, I would say, as far as the range. So here's what that sounds like. In an orchestra, you also have woodwinds. So here on this swell, the Récy division, I have the basson, or the bassoon. Now, unlike a normal bassoon, this can play all the way up to the edge of the keyboard. So it doesn't quite sound like a bassoon when it's up in its highest range. We also have an oboe. And we also have a trumpet. So just in those 5 or 6 stops I've shown you, that's already a lot of variety. We also have what we call diapasons, which is sort of the generic organ sound you might think of. So let me play that for you. So the diapason, that's sort of the base of a hymn sound. I would always pull that on first. It's warm and it's a bit wider and it provides a good foundation. There are lots of harmonics that the human ear can latch onto and hear the tone pretty well. And yes, and so we have these different levels of keyboards. We have 3 on this organ, and we have a trumpet on the top one, we have a trumpet on the middle one, and we have a trumpet on the bottom one. So just take a listen to see how those 3 trumpets are different. So one of them might have sounded a bit more distant, and that is because actually, as far as where they are located, is different. So things that are on the top keyboard or the top manual are going to be over on the opposite side. The ones that are in the middle are up here on the right, if you're facing the sanctuary, on my left at the moment. And the one that is on the bottom here is also up here. So the different divisions, which is what these levels are called, have different colors available usually, but also are located in different places. So it may be that you're accompanying the choir who's here, and so you use something that is closer to them rather than playing something that the whole congregation might be able to hear more easily. And that's another thing that will vary from organ to organ. So a lot of times if you show up at a new organ that you haven't played before, you just have to spend a few minutes playing around and hearing how things sound. And sometimes things may sound different to you where you're sitting here than they do out in the room. So you might have to bring a friend and say, how does that sound? And then play this. And so it's a whole journey of discovery sometimes. Let's see. So it's an orchestra, that's right. We also have percussion, by the way. I haven't used this very much so far in the church service, but I'm sure you'll recognize this stop. Our bells are sometimes called, it's a Zimbelstern. This one is called clochette. but all different names to mean that they're bells. And actually, it's really cool how that mechanism works. Usually, you've got a sort of circular wheel with bells, and when you pull that out, the air that's constantly available for the organ pushes through and causes it to rotate. And that's how you get the beautiful, not dinging, but I can't think of the word right now, the onomatopoetic word, but the beautiful bell sounds. So, and of course, I failed to mention the sort of percussive aspect of the pedals as well. I'm guessing you won't be able to hear this, but our biggest pipe is 32 feet long, and that means it sounds 2 or 3 octaves lower than what would we call the default pitch level. And that means it's a note that you not only hear, but you can feel the vibrations. So I'm gonna play it. I'm pretty sure you won't be able to hear it, but let's see. So if you were here, if you were standing by the altar right now and I played that, you would feel it shaking. And that's a really cool thing to do too. My brother went to Oberlin and they have a big organ there. And I know they would have a Friday night organ pump. And at the end, everyone would climb up to the stage and lay down so they could feel the vibrations in the last piece, which I thought was really cool. So it's an orchestra, but it's also a way to collaborate with other people in case you don't want to play everything yourself. So that manifests as accompanying the choir in anthems. There's such a rich repertoire of music that is 300 years old or was written yesterday. And I'm really grateful that here at Glenn, we tend to do a wide range of repertoire from different time periods. And also I get to accompany you, the congregation, in hymns especially, which I find really, really special. If there's a well-known, well-beloved hymn that everyone is really singing with gusto, and I get to play with a lot of organ, it's just the best feeling in the world to hear those voices sort of in sync with me. And sometimes the organ gets to play with an orchestra. I just found out that I'll be playing the Saint-Saëns organ, not concerto, but organ symphony in November with the Emory Youth Symphony over at Schwartz. So that's exciting. So there are many, many ways. Organ does not have to only be that boring church instrument that you hear in the background. I think it's a dynamic instrument. And it's useful in many contexts. So we have church, of course, but we have convocation, we have recitals. You wouldn't believe how many people make their living by playing organ recitals all over Europe and America and Asia. So that there is demand for that, believe it or not. And of course, weddings and funerals. A lot of times it's very special and sentimental for someone. Oh, you know, my grandmother loved this hymn. Could you play it, or could you improvise on it or something? And it's really special to be able to contribute to a service in that way too. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with cinema or theater organs. I know we must have a theater here that has a theater organ. Yeah, and it's great, you know, of course, in the old days, it actually accompanied the films, or maybe it just played in between films or beforehand or afterwards. But there is still a school of people that learn how to play in that style. I'm not one of them. I really appreciate it, but it's sort of a thing that takes a lot more having a good ear rather than just reading the music. Usually you make your own arrangements for that kind of music, and you have to really know those old standards pretty well. And it's not something I've tried, but I definitely appreciate it and enjoy hearing it. And of course, the organ shows up in jazz all the time too. Again, not part of my wheelhouse, but something I really appreciate. Now here's some background information about this organ. It was installed in May 1982, and it has a total of 61 notes for each of these keyboard levels, 61. And in the pedal, there are 32 notes. So I know you can't see it right now in this view, but the pedal is basically like a big keyboard, but for your feet. And I wonder if we should have a guessing game. How many pipes do you think there are in total? Does anyone want to take a guess? You count both sides, how many pipes? I can just tell.
182.
Oh, that is a good guess, but there are far, far, far more than that.
Whoops.
Dave, that was Dave, not me.
3,428.
Very close. There are that's a good guess. There are 3,836 pipes.
Oh my goodness.
I know. you know, you can't see them because we have this beautiful screen and facade. But maybe next time you're here, not during a service, you can wander up. If you look behind the altar, you can sort of look through that grating and you can see some pipes there. But you have to keep in mind, not every pipe is 32 feet long. The ones that make the highest sounds are the smallest. So there are literally some pipes that are this big, and they're probably the shrillest ones, but they count as well for that total number, 3,800. So yeah, it's a lot. This organ is made by a company called Käthe Wright, and that company is based in Quebec. And so I'd like to say that this organ has a French accent. The way that manifests is the names of the stops. So instead of saying trumpet, it'll say trompette, or what's another example? Instead of saying oboe, it'll say hautbois. So as an organist, you have to sort of know, oh, okay, this is a French organ, so I need to look for this because on an English organ, it'll use a different word than it will on a German organ, than it will on, etc. A Spanish organ, for example. So you have to sort of know your languages, at least for those instrument names, pretty well. Also, French organs tend to have very intense reed sounds. So if you remember the oboe and the trumpet that I played for you earlier, they're really sort of nasally and biting, and they bite through the sound. And on an English organ, for example, like the ones I played when I spent time over there, the oboe will probably be a bit more mellow. So that's just another thing that's interesting. And again, it's something that you can assume based on an organ's accent, how something will sound, but the only way to really get to know it is to play through it yourself and use your own ears to decide. Yeah, and so the last thing I want to talk about is the re-leathering project that we are in the middle of. You may have heard, so when I first arrived for a good 8 to 10 weeks, we had only one side of the organ in. So the side that is to my right, or to your left if you're facing the altar, was out of commission for a while. And that's because we were getting the leather replaced. And the leather is, it's used in many different moving parts, but mostly it's useful to stop wind leaking so that the organ is more efficient. But leather ages and it dries and it cracks. And I think, I'm not sure when the last time we got it re-leathered, but usually it's good to do every 50 to 60 years. And so it's more of a preventative thing rather than a reactive thing. Thankfully, it's not that the organ wasn't working unless we did this, but it will help secure it for future years. So at the moment, we've done half of it re-leathered, and we've gotten that half back, which I'm very excited about because I have access to more sounds now. We still have to re-leather this side, but we're going to wait to do that until after the sort of homecoming season and Advent and Christmas. We're also going to get a new console, which is actually where I sit and the keyboards and everything that I play. And that will be good because, you know, there are tiny little mechanical things that sometimes don't work. And ideally we want things to be consistent. So that will be happening after Christmas. And hopefully the organ will be back in March, definitely in time for Easter. Don't worry about that, but hopefully in March. And I hope to present some sort of organ recital to celebrate everything being sort of brand new and refreshed. So you can look forward to that. Hopefully COVID will allow that schedule to continue as planned. Great, so I thought I might close just by playing a little piece here. Again, disclaimer that the sound may be a bit strange and I apologize for that, but I am going to play this in church in a few weeks. So if you don't hear it well today, just tune in to the live stream or come on Sunday. I think it'll be the first or second week of September, I'm gonna play this. So this is a piece by Felix Mendelssohn, and it was written in the mid-19th century, early 19th century, and it's called Andante and Variations in D major. So at the beginning, you're going to hear a theme, which is just like a lovely little melody. And then you'll hear that same melody come back in different forms, using different organ stops and sounds, and in sort of different styles. Towards the end, it's pretty loud, but then it finishes quietly again. So it's sort of like an arc as far as the volume goes. And you'll have to forgive me, I'm playing off my iPad because that's easier to deal with when there's no one to turn the pages for you. So I apologize if I have to fumble a bit to get that going. So here we go, this is Andante and Variations in D major by Felix Mendelssohn. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. So.
Well, thank you so much, Käthe. Go ahead, Alan.
Did you have to do a recital for both degrees, I guess?
Yes, so for my undergraduate, which was 4 years, the first 2 years I had to do half an hour of memorized music. And the second 2 years was an hour, a different hour each year. Two years, an hour memorized. And then for my master's each year, or the first year was half an hour and the second was an hour recital, but all memorized, which is a whole different story.
Mm-hmm.
Because that means you're relying on muscle memory, but also trying to remember how to be musical and not be too nervous to play the right notes. And I'm glad I'm through that.
Yeah.
I'm glad this is being recorded because I would wish that 200 people could have heard your lovely presentation. That was really charming and instructive and everything.
Yes.
There, I wanted to mention to you, there is a theater organ in Atlanta. At
Oh,
the
yeah, the
Fox
Fox.
Theater.
That's right. I was
The
trying
Mighty
to,
Mo.
I
Isn't
couldn't-
it called the Mighty Mo?
And
Yes.
you would probably enjoy seeing it when they do it because the person comes up from under the floor. This would be great at church if you came up from under the floor, and, you know, sort of fireworks went off and that sort of thing.
It's definitely a spectacle, isn't it?
You may have said this organ has 3,000 plus pipes. Is that typical of all organs to have that number of pipes?
Well, I would say this organ is probably, as far as church organs go, it's probably on the medium to medium large size. But yeah, so the other number I didn't say was the number of ranks. So each stop is a rank of pipes. So it's when you pull out one stop, you're engaging 32 or 62 pipes, one for every note on the keyboard. Yeah.
Wow.
So each rank will have at least 60, if not more, because sometimes when you pull out a stop, more than one rank plays at the same time, depending on what kind of stop it is. So it's not hard for that number to grow really quickly when you're talking about pipe totals. But I would say this instrument is probably a medium-sized to medium-large sized organ as church organs go.
I'm surprised that we need a new console. Does that mean that whole thing what'll happen to it?
It'll, well, I think it's more that the computer inside the console is a bit old, and it gets to a point with technology where it's easier to replace rather than fix, especially
Oh.
technology has moved on since the 80s.
Mm.
So it has to do with the way we save our registrations. You may have noticed I was pressing some buttons, and it's sort of like a preset. I press a button and certain number of stops will pop out, and that's something I planned ahead of time, so I don't have to use my hands to pull all the stops out in the middle of a piece. And so sometimes the system that captures that and helps the memory for the capture system, that's something that as time goes on may start to malfunction, which we wouldn't want in the middle of a church service, for example.
Wow. Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Have you played the one at Schwartz?
I had, yeah, last week actually, I was introduced to it and I had a few minutes to explore it a bit. It's a great space.
Yes.
I hope that, I'm sorry, I hope that another time we can do this in the little chapel. That's a beautiful instrument there that did not get played much for a while, but a couple of years ago, we had a Sunday school class where we got to hear the story of the instrument and all about it. So it's probably not polite to immediately ask for second helpings after you just did such a thorough presentation, but before I forget it, maybe one of these years we can do that. I'd love to see you do that. Thank you.
Do you have any relationship now or expect a relationship with the Candler School of Theology and this sacred music program there?
Personally, I don't at this time. I don't know how that will change in the future.
Okay.
Now that they all see this video, maybe. But John, it's a good reminder that Käthe has a couple of her, at least a couple of your videos, short videos you've done on, if you go on the Glen Church YouTube channel, she's done a few from the little chapel, from that organ as well. So you can go back and watch those. But thank you all for being here. I'll go ahead and we'll say thank you, and we'll end the recording, and then we can stay on for a couple minutes. So thank you so much, Käthe.
Yeah.